things like the 8 verses of training mind require that you have some practice under your belt, require that you have some understanding under your belt. Otherwise, that 8 verses would make no sense. If you were to give that to an Israeli or a Palestinian or Hamas and let them read that, they'd say, "What are you, crazy?" You know, it's just like the leader of Israel said, "This is a time for war." Well, that's the opposite of the 8 verses of training the mind, right? This is a time for war. And people are so oriented to identify themselves as a separate self that makes perfect sense to them. You know, you did this, now we're going to do that. Makes perfect sense to them. Eye for an eye makes perfect sense when you're identifying yourself as a separate self. So it takes some understanding and some practice and some teaching under your belt to even engage with the 8 verses of training the mind. The leader of Israel could have easily said, "This is a time for peace," right? He wouldn't last 24 hours after saying that, right? Because he understands that you can't lead people to behave in a way that is 100% inconsistent with their makeup. You can't, even if it's true, even if it's the right thing to do. You can't lead people to do that because in their makeup and in their personality, with their personality thinking and their personality feeling, a situation like that, you know, they are so angry, they are so outraged. You know, those soldiers that were waiting to go into Gaza Strip, you know, they couldn't wait to get in there and start killing, because for them it was like for them it was personal. See what I mean? Personality, personal. For them it was personal. That's like you killed my child when you killed that child, that type of thing. And it's very intense. It's very powerful. It's a very strong energy. That's why my teacher was talking about this, and he said, you know, given that we're living in a cause and effect reality, the effects and causes involved in these types of things will last for generations, because of the energy that's involved in it and so forth. So, you know, I highly recommend not just studying the 8 verses for training the mind, but practicing the 8 verses of training the mind. I do it every day with my wife. The best place to practice is with the people you're closest to that will push your buttons, you know, that will trigger you. That's the opportunity for you to realize that there is nothing to fight about. There's nobody to prove anything to. There's nothing to be right about. It's not easy to see. I understand it's not easy to see, you know, when your orientation is the common conditioning that most people have. It's confusing when your orientation is the orientation that common people have. You know, the Dalai Lama said, when he was teaching about no self, he said, if you, in the ordinary way that people function, in the ordinary way that people operate, in the ordinary understanding that people have, there's clearly a self. Right? In the ordinary way that people understand things, there's clearly a self. However, if you investigate, so if you don't investigate, there's no, you know, everybody's walking around with there's no doubt in their mind that there's a self, that I am a self, you know, and I am a doer, and I make things happen, you know, that's the common understanding across humanity. It's not the truth. And what the Dalai Lama said is that, you know, it's easy to operate as if it's true because everybody is operating as if it's true, and that's what's generating the idea, not the truth, because there is no self. And what he said is if you investigate it, the evidence will reveal the truth. Right now, he mentioned that there are neuroscientists that are doing brain scans, and one of the things that they have done in brain scans is try and find the self in the brain. There's an area there's area of the brain for seeing, and there's an area of brain for hearing, and there's areas of the brain for executive function, and all that stuff. But they've done a lot of different ways of trying to see if there's a way to find a center in the brain that would be the area of self, the center of operation called the self. And they can't find anything. There's nothing there. There's just nothing there. So upon investigating it, you can't find it. You can't find it in your body. You can't find it in your brain. And the reason you can't find it in either one of those places is because it doesn't exist. And you know, the other thing that he said that was interesting is he said that he's not, the teaching doesn't say that there's no personality. It doesn't say that. And the personality is considered to be the self for people. That's who you are, as the person, the personality. But the teaching doesn't say there's no personality. Not only that, but what the Dalai Lama said is the personality is very important. So the personality is very important. See, people hear this like, oh, there's no self. So if there's no self, if I can see that truth and experience that truth, that will give me liberation from the suffering of being a self. Well, that may be true, but that's still a lopsided understanding. And that's why he said the personality is very important, very important. He said because the personality, and I've said this here, personality has to be strong. Personality has to be strong enough to not fight when the situation arises. Personality has to be strong. That's the personality that's practicing the 8 verses of the mind. Right? So personality is critical. It's important. The personality, without the personality and without the ego and without there being a strong ego, you couldn't do this work. Could you? How could you do it? You have to be strong. You have to have enough of a strong composition as a personality and a strong sense of yourself as a personality to do this work, to do these practices, to practice meditation. Where is it coming from when you can practice meditation and get beyond your comfort level? You know, I said to Patricia, I don't know whether it was today or yesterday, when she was walking around the track, I stopped and said to her, I said, when you want to stop walking, that's when you start practicing walking, because that's when the walking will matter. If you're comfortable walking and you're not challenged by it at all, you're not going to grow. You're not going to learn anything. You're not going to get outside of your comfort level. Same thing with meditation, right? When you want to stop sitting, that's when the sitting really starts. Because the stopping sitting is coming from the thinking, isn't it? And the thinking is what we're trying to get away from following. So it was very interesting what the Dalai Lama said. Your ego has to be strong enough to die. Because in these practices and teachings, in a certain sense, if you succeed in the practice and teachings, you will have committed suicide. And so your ego has to be strong enough to die. And the death that we're talking about is not the death of killing the body. It has to be strong enough to let go of the identification with the idea, with the belief that there is a self. And when you examine it, what you see, not only is there not a self, but the selfing, Paul Hederman calls it selfing. The generation of the self is called selfing. Since there's no self, it's got to be generated, right? He calls it selfing. Well, if there's no location in the brain that's the center of the self, then how does selfing get created? What the Dalai Lama said is that when you see the truth of it, and when you start to practice seeing things as they actually are, what most people call the self is seen to you to be a mirage. That's what he said. It is seen to be a mirage. You will see people and you will see their personality as a mirage, and beyond that will be their true nature. And when you can be that way in real time with people, right, it gets easier to deal with not getting into conflict, right? Because you understand the conflict you will be getting into is your conditioning opposing their conditioning, and their conditioning opposing your conditioning. It's senseless. It's all machinery. It's all mechanical. It's all automatic. That's why you feel so helpless after you lose it. That's why you feel so helpless after you get angry and you misbehave, because the misbehaving is coming from the programming that says that you're a separate self and therefore you have to be offensive and defensive whenever you feel threatened by anything.
What's the difference between walking and practicing walking?
Practicing walking is paying attention to the body walking instead of thinking while the body's walking. Same thing with meditation. Meditation is paying attention to the body breathing instead of thinking. It's that simple. It's that simple. But if you check in with yourself when you're walking anytime, check in with yourself when you're walking anytime, you'll find you're thinking. You're not walking, you're thinking. The body's walking, but you're ignoring it. Right? So it's just an opportunity to be awake and see what's really happening. What's really happening is the body's walking. Right? And to see the body walking, to be aware of the body walking, can only occur if you get out of your head. If you stop thinking, you can't be thinking and being aware of the body walking at the same time. You've got to practice getting away from one and into the other. And if you practice walking, you will discover, and I've discovered, because I walk every single day, right? And I've discovered, over time, I discovered that I really didn't know how to walk. Sounds crazy. But it's true. Most people don't know how to walk. When I walk around the track and I look at people, what they're doing, you can call it walking. It's a rough sketch. It's a rough example of walking. But if you look closely at it, they're not walking. Their feet are all wrong, and they're not walking straight. They're not relaxed. They're walking is an art. Walking is an art, just like everything else. And if you start paying attention to walking, it can become very interesting to walk. It can become a very interesting experience, to experience what it feels like, what the body feels like when it's walking. There's a lot going on when you're walking. So, what the Dalai Lama was talking about was the fact that these teachings of no self, they're not trying to tell you that you got anything wrong. They're not trying to tell you to be different than you are. No, they're not telling you. You'll still behave the way you behave. The selfing, the generation of self, since there's no self, it has to be generated. How does it get generated? It gets generated in two ways. It gets generated in thinking. You think there is one, right? So you think as if you are the thinker, that there's a self. You think there is one, right? And then the other way it gets generated by activity. You act as if there is one. People act like they're the doer. The Buddha said their actions occur, deeds are done, and there's no doer therein. That's the no self teaching that the Dalai Lama was talking about. Mm-hmm. Now here's the thing because the thing that, when I talk to you here, I'm trying to encourage you and inspire you, and I'm trying to point to ways of looking at the truth that will allow you to recognize it, so that through that recognition, you will become more involved with consistently paying attention to reality. Through that recognition, you will become more involved with consistently paying attention to reality, and if you do that, your life will start to transform. You'll start to behave differently, you'll start to feel differently, you'll start to experience your life differently. And so anything that I can come up with to say to you that might make it clear just how far down the rabbit hole we've gone can be helpful. And I was listening to Lama Lena. Was it her that said this? I think it was her. I was listening to one of the teachers. And it was interesting. She said, when you learn to read, when you were a kid and you learned to read, right? It started out, you were just looking at letters, right? It didn't mean anything to you, right? And then through repetition, somebody said, this means this word, this letter means that. When you put these letters together, it means this word. And they kept repeating the word. So when you look at the word, you started to see the word. You didn't see the word. But then through repetition, and somebody keep telling you, no, that's a word, say the word, look at the word, read the word. Eventually got to the point where you could read, right? Now, once you could read, watch. Once you could read, could you look at a word and not read it? No. You can't go back and unlearn how to read. Now watch. So in the same way, when you learn to be a personality, you can't not be the personality. It's like looking at a word and reading it. See if you can get that. Your personality is like looking at a word and reading it. You can't not read the word. You learned it so thoroughly that all you have to do is look at the word and your brain reads it. You can't stop it. Same thing is true with your personality. All you have to do is wake up and open your eyes in the morning and your brain has you be the personality. You can't stop it. Same exact thing, right? But the truth is, what you're looking at on the page when you read, right, is literally meaningless symbols, isn't it? For somebody that doesn't know how to read, they're just symbols there. They don't mean anything, right? So the interpretation of those symbols causes reading. And that's a function of the brain, right? The interpretation of the data coming into the brain causes the world. The interpretation of the data coming into the brain causes the world to occur to you the way it occurs to you. And one of the ways it occurs to you is it occurs to you as if people are doing things. It looks like they're doing things. And so the way the self gets generated, it gets generated through the thinking activity, right? Because you infer that the thoughts are yours, that the voice in your head is you. That creates a self. It's not there, but it creates a self, generates a self, right? And that also generates a self by the way that you perceive what's happening with people's behavior is that they're doing something. And so they're acting as if they're doing something, and they're acting as if there's a person there doing something. They're acting as if that's the case, and therefore the inference is that they are doing something and that there is somebody there, when there is no one there and they are not doing anything. That's the teaching of no self, and that's the teaching of no free will. And those are the two hardest things. It's interesting, those are the two hardest teachings for people to grasp. Why? Because they go directly opposite to what you believe and how you behave and what you have considered to be true and the way you live your life. Directly opposite to it, directly opposite to it. And that's why it's rejected, and that's why it's found to be unacceptable, because it seems to imply something that's too dramatic and too radical and not workable. But that's not true. It doesn't imply that at all. It doesn't imply that you should stop being a person. In fact, as the Dalai Lama said, what he said is you should be a person, and you should make sure you're a strong person. You should make sure you're an intelligent person. You should make sure you have a strong constitution as a person. You're going to need it. If you're going to be a spiritual person, you're going to need a strong ego. You're going to need a strong personality to get you through the challenges of practicing no self, to get you through the challenges of experiencing and practicing the way things actually are. But the beauty of it is, if you can stay the course, if you can persist, if you can continue to go do it, and if you can continue to do the practices, eventually the hold of the mind on you releases. Eventually the conditioning of your brain releases. And when it releases, you recognize, oh, this doesn't mean what I thought it meant. I didn't change at all. I'm still a personality, but now I'm happy. I'm still a personality, but now I feel peaceful. I'm still a personality, but now I feel satisfied. I'm still a personality, but now I can see a way to be in the world that's effective. I can see a way to be in my relationships with the people I'm close to that will work. So I don't have to suffer. I don't have to be in conflict with them like most people are in conflict with each other. Like I often say here, you know, the best people can do to manage relationship to the people closest to them is get a license to protect themselves from the other person leaving. It's called marriage, right? And then get good at tolerating the other person, and then get good at coping with the situation. That's what's going on, isn't it? It has to go that way, right? Because you as a separate self, right, that has as your constitution to protect yourself above and beyond all, right? Your constitution says pay close attention to what's coming at you, and the way you're paying attention to it is it a threat or not? That's the number one thing, is it a threat or not, right? And your interpretation to determine whether it's a threat or not is corrupt. Your interpretation to determine whether it's a threat or not is corrupt, right? Because if your conditioning was such that, right, if your conditioning was such that you had certain experiences when you were a child where you were abused or neglected, right? Which goes on all the time because we're passing the craziness down. And if you had experiences like that, then anybody that shows up in your world that behaves in any way, shape, or form that resembles that which happened to you that hurt you when you were a child, you go to war. And it doesn't have to be true, it's just your interpretation. Yeah? The person can say something without having any idea that it's hurting you. The person can say something without having any idea that it's upsetting you. Because they don't know what happened to you in the past that is triggering. And so that's the way it goes. It's blind. It's the blind fighting with the blind. You know, people don't know. People have no idea what's really going on. They have their beliefs about it. They have their perceptions of it. They have their thoughts about it. They have their feelings about it. And that leads them to behave in ways that are inappropriate and destructive and cause suffering to themselves and other people. That's an ordinary existence. I'm not talking about criminal behavior. That's an ordinary existence. If you look at your life, just watch what's going on when you're driving your car in traffic. Perfect example of what I'm talking about. It's a common experience that we all have. And it's not that there's some of us that, you know, that are good and that doesn't, there's not that there's some of us that are good people that are above all that shit and they don't get pissed off when they're driving in the car. That's not true. It's across the board because it's a function of your brain. It's a function of your identity that you're in your car driving. You're separate from everybody else driving, right? And you're all trying to get to the same place, right? And the way you have been brought up from being a child is anytime you find yourself in a group of people that's heading in a direction, that's called competition, right? So even though you're not going to get to the next red light any sooner than anybody else, you can't help it. You can't help it. And if anybody's in front of you and they're not going fast enough and you see other people getting by, it bothers you. What are they doing? Why are they doing that? Right?
But if you humble yourself, then you lag back and let everybody go in front of you.
If you practice not being crazy, then you practice driving a car in a sane way with the understanding that there's no reason to be in a hurry. There is no emergency going on. Stop acting like it's a racetrack. But it takes practice because the way you've been conditioned is to see anything where there's a group of people heading in the same direction. It's called competition, and your brain automatically has you try and do whatever you can to get in front. So, so don't point the finger at other people and say, oh, see how you are about driving? We're all like that. We're all like that. It comes with the equipment. It comes with your brain. It comes with the conditioning. So the way out of it is to understand that these teachings are about going sane. These teachings are about coming to the understanding. If you study the teaching of no self, if you study the truth, if you study what's actually reality, and even though it is not at all the way you had it figured out, even though it's not at all the way you've been conditioned, if you give it a chance and you stay with it long enough so you start to see the light starts coming through to you, you start seeing it for yourself instead of just, understanding it, right? That's why I say here, and I was saying in the last class, understanding is okay, conceptual information is necessary, that's the way we function, right? But what we're talking about here has to go beyond that. Has to go beyond what you understand. Has to go beyond conceptualization because the experience you're having of what you are and the truth is non-conceptual. You can't think the truth. And one of the ways we're limited is we think if we can't think something, it doesn't exist. That eliminates most of reality, doesn't it? Doesn't it? If you can't think something that doesn't exist, if that was true, it means most of reality doesn't exist.